Very important time to be taking this information into account. Are there two factions of elites fighting for supremacy, fighting for the future of humanity? Well, we know there's one faction. We just don't know if the so-called good guys still exist. So let's keep reading. This is part 5. Macedonian policies. The Aristotelians were essentially distinguished by their determination to wipe out the human race's memory of Ionian, i.e. Platonic, scientific methods, and to eliminate the influence of humanist city-builder policies. They, as agents of the joint Persian-Macedonian policies of the cult of Apollo, were committed to what the Macedonian court of Philip identified as the Persian model. This was, as we noted above, a policy of suppressing urban-centered culture and technological progress in behalf of the rule of society by a landlord oligarchy allied to the monetarist bankers centered in Delphi and Mesopotamia. The Macedonian court thus expressed the same policies and sociological outlook as the British Black Guelph oligarchy of the past centuries to date. Ironically, the sodomy prevailing in the court of Macedon contributed to Philip's undoing. A member of his court had been gang sodomized at the order of another. Philip not only refused to punish the perpetrator, but instead appointed the criminal to the governorship of a province. This motivated the victim to become the assassin of Philip at a most appropriate point in history, on the very eve of the intended implementation of the joint project of Philip and the Persian court circles. In this connection, we should re-emphasize what we have outlined above in connection with Aristotelian religious cults. The commonplace blunder of professed Marxists and others in assessing British policies is the mistaken assumption that the ruling forces of the British oligarchy are motivated by specifically capitalist impulses. We see people getting this wrong all the time on social media. It's so tiresome. Anyway, going on. It is, of course, the case that the British oligarchy and its global allies live in a world in which the industrial capitalist forms of manufacturing, agricultural trade and culture are the premise upon which human existence depends. It is also true that world rule to this date in recent modern history has been feasible only to the extent that representatives of the Black Guelph oligarchy controlled the financial power and state material power adapted to industrial capitalist development. However, to conclude from such and related evidence valid up to a point, that the British oligarchy's motives are subsumed under the rubric of capitalist is the grossest of blunders of incompetencies. The Welfen were originally a bucolic German aristocratic house associated with the rule of Franconia, with branches in Italy. I think they're connected with the Este family, which people have traced almost every important house in Europe back to the Este family, which originates, I think, in Ferrara. Anyway, during the 11th century, through an alliance among Roman banking families centered around the Pierleoni, including Matilda of Tuscany and the ruling house of Lotharingen-Lorraine, now Habsburg-Lorraine, the oligarchical faction of the present millennium acquired the name Guelph through the marriage connection of Matilda of Tuscany's house to the Welfen house. In the course of developments following the Guelph defeat of the Hohenstaufen house, Frederick Barbarossa through Frederick II, During the events of 1266, 1268 AD, there arose the Guelph the Guelph versus the Ghibellines, and then here in parentheses, Ghibelline equals Italianized Weiblingen. I think it's Weiblingen, the castle of Weiblingen, as Guelph was italicized. The Guelph was an Italianized Welf. Disputes, you can call it that. It was really kind of a madcap, insane, and very intense period. These two warring, it's kind of like the culture wars in the United States. Now, very similar. You had the urbane, metropolitan cultural centers of banking of major cities, the culture there, ensconced or prevailing cultures, versus, and they were aligned with the Pope, not because they were religious, terribly religious or devoted to Catholicism, but because they recognized and leveraged the power that they held as bankers to the Pope. This group versus the more rural culture in areas that were in their thinking and in their outlook aligned with the city builders of particularly, specifically with the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire to the north, and felt that the Holy Roman Empire, specifically the emperor, was key to what they considered the values that they wanted to live by. And just to reiterate, that would be that's the Ghibellines, and they're associated with the city builders and progress, and what later you might associate with nationalism, or at least these principles of ennobling the citizen and promoting pro-humanist projects like healthcare and education and basic liberties, right? So anyway, going on. In the internal struggles within Italy and elsewhere, at the onset of the 14th century, the Italian branches of the Guelph aristocracy split into a white Guelph and a black Guelph faction. The former, one to the humanist policies otherwise associated with the Ghibellines, Hohenstaufen-Weiblingen faction. Dante Alighieri was a leading thinker of the former faction, the white Guelphs, and they, although officially aligned with the Pope, they promoted accommodation or sharing power, acknowledging and accommodating the Holy Roman Emperor as a leader. They didn't see him as illegitimate, and were not wholly devoted to the Pope as were the black Guelphs. Dante Alighieri was a leading thinker for the former faction. From the early 14th century, the anti-humanist oligarchical faction of Europe has represented the continuity of the black Guelph faction of Dante's time. The Capetian house in France, the later Habsburg, whose significance dates from the emergence of the black Guelph faction in which that household is predominantly a part, and the majority of the aristocratic households of Europe have been predominantly a conscious continuation of the traditions and policies of the Guelph faction of the 11th century and its black Guelph continuation since the onset of the 14th century. The term black nobility in today's Italy refers with approximate exactness to the present-day continuation of the black Guelph oligarchical families in Italy. So we look to, the very important links, ties of tribute, loyalty between, say, the House of Windsor and the Pallavicini family, where the house, we have reports of, well, there's this, let's call it anecdotal, but I would give it a great deal of credence. Princess Diana talking about going with Queen Elizabeth to Venice to meet with I can't remember her name now, who was the head of the family. She's passed away, the head of the Pallavicini family, and paying tribute, because the Pallavicini family actually continues to rank higher than the House of Windsor. And Britain had, I think, relied on the Pallavicini family to finance their war against Spain. So we also have, of course, the House of Windsor. They are Guelphs. Anyway, going on. Aristocratic families do not necessarily mean black Guelph. However, the case of the Bourbon House of France and Spain illustrates the point. The humanist tradition within the French monarchical houses dates from the 15th century, Louis XI. The humanist tradition, now we're looking at more Ghibelline outlook, whose father, and I've heard it said that Louis XI, France under Louis XI represents the emergence of the modern nation state with what is social insurance. What would you call it? Safety nets, with social safety nets and an emphasis on universal education. They really went after Louis XI, though. Louis XI, whose father Charles was a despicable Guelphish monster, the humanist city-building policies of Louis XI were continued by the House of Navarre during the 16th century and continued by the 17th century politique, Richelieu, Mazarin, Colbert. In fulfillment of Richelieu's anti-Habsburg policy, France of Mazarin et al., allied with Cromwell's English Commonwealth, finally humbled the Habsburgs in 1653, leading to the Bourbon succession in Spain. The Bourbon monarchs were a mixed lot, as typified by the case of Louis XIV. The Bourbon tendency expressed by Louis XIV's minister Colbert and by Descartes and Huygens was one current. The rural aristocratic input into Louis XIV was the Guelphish side. The case of the ill-fated clock hobbyist Louis XVI, less interesting than his exceptional contemporary Joseph II of Austria's Habsburgs, illustrates the case of monarchs pulled toward the humanist side of policies, just as the Duc d'Orléans was not only a raving Guelph, but an agent of the British monarchy. Prior to the hegemony of Godoy in the Spanish court, the Spanish Bourbon court of the mid-18th century was a center of influence of the French faction to which the painter Francisco Goya was attached. This faction of the Spanish Bourbon court developed a humanist city-building project policy for Greater Spain and contributed in a vital way to the fostering of the humanist currents in such later Latin American nations as Mexico. The English Tudors are another example of the problem. The case of Richard III of England is open to fresh scrutiny. The case of Warwick is of more immediate interest. In any event, the accession of the Tudors involved the influences associated with Louis XI of France, and apart from peculiarities of some of the Tudor monarchs as such, the humanists gathered around the Dudley family are key to everything decent that occurred in England during the 16th century and immediately thereafter. The accurate view of the role of the European aristocracy and monarchical families in general is twofold. First of all, these families were divided overall and internally on fundamental issues of policy. Some representatives were deeply committed to humanist or anti-humanist policies. Others vacillated under pressure of opposite factions, as did Elizabeth I of England. Second, the point against the institution of monarchy made by Machiavelli, I'm not sure that's, well, yes, okay, we'll just go with that, and emphasized in denouncing both monarchy and democracy by Thomas Paine, that hereditary monarchy subject to radical changes in the policy outlook of the state's chief, hereditary executive from generation to generation, proved itself to be intolerable to the humanist interest. The case of the Russian Tsars is also exemplary. The humanist leader of later Byzantium, the Paleologs, rose to power through a persisting conspiracy of the humanists of Central Europe. Henry V of Germany, in approximately 1106 AD, assigned a humanist aristocratic family of Italy from Viterbo outside Rome to infiltrate the establishment of Byzantium. As the Paleologs, this humanist aristocratic family gained the rulership of Byzantium during the 13th century, holding that power until the Turkish conquest, 1453, arranged by the perfervidly Aristotelian patriarch of the Eastern Church and the bankers of Rome traditionally controlling the papacy. That would be primarily, I think it was the Venetians. However, among the positive heritages of the Paleologs was their humanist influence in Russia, establishing the policy of Ivan III and Ivan IV, the awesome, not the terrible. Despite the efforts of Ivan IV's political heirs, Boris Godunov and the Habsburg-led evil, then seizing continental Europe, led to the undoing of much of the humanist efforts of the Tsars, producing a post-Boris period of chaos, which ended only with the emergence of the Romanovs. So, that's fascinating because we see today as sadly just a continuation of this. Anyway, from Peter I, the Romanovs were under the influence increasingly of Anglo-Dutch penetrations of the Russian court. Barring the curious case of the death of Catherine in the 18th century, every Tsar died a sudden death, exactly at the point Anglo-Dutch policy interest prescribed this demise. English physicians attached to the Tsarist household were not irrelevant to such abrupt departures from life of the Tsars, nor was it irrelevant that British intelligence services conduiting funds through their agent Alexander Herzen funded Bakunin and controlled the Russian anarchist movement and its terrorist offshoot. Nor is it astonishing that when Count Witte was embarked on a policy for promoting the industrial development of Russia in closer relationship to Germany, the Russia 1905 revolution was organized with the leading role of Anglo-Dutch Samuel agent Alexander Helpont Parvus, and with the leading role of Parvus's protege of that moment, Leon D. Trotsky, Karl Radek, N. Bukharin, G. Ryazanov were agents of the Anglo-Dutch, Royal Dutch Shell, intelligence networks featuring Parvis. The doctor's plot against Stalin's life was probably no exaggeration at all. That was my thought. And remember, this brings to mind when Elliot Roosevelt met with Stalin after his father's death. Stalin told Elliot flat out, he said, the Churchill gang got your father. And, although FDR was sick, he was sickly through most of his life, his death was suspicious, and his decline was suspiciously precipitous. And it's rumored that he was poisoned, and I don't think Stalin would have said that spuriously. All right. As Thomas Paine emphasized, monarchy is an unacceptable form of government in the humanist interest, but sections of the aristocracy and monarchs have been, nonetheless, dedicated humanists. I must say here, I'm not with Thomas Paine on this. I don't denigrate monarchy at all. But as you see, it's very interesting to consider Dante's book De Monarchia, which I'm reading now, which kind of places the responsibility for the success of any form of government on the quality of the citizens. And he addresses some very deep, important issues in that book. I recommend everybody read it, De Monarchia. Anyway, going on. And also this book was banned and burned at one point. And they said that Dante was cheerleading for monarchy. But in fact, he was not. He was talking about something much deeper and much more profound. Anyway, let's go on. Exemplary of the latter point is the case of the Salian Holy Roman Emperors from Otto I through Henry IV, and the Hohenstaufen Emperors from Frederick Barbarossa through Frederick II. The thrust of these Holy Roman Emperors was earlier expressed by Charlemagne. They were predominantly humanists, city builders. The policies otherwise expressed by Abelard were embedded in the building of urban-centered culture and trade routes, north-south and east-west by the Salian emperors. The urban culture of Europe did not emerge by some spontaneous principle within feudalism, quote-unquote, but because leading dirigist monarchs where are we? What happened? Leading dirigist monarchs and others steered the application of, quote-unquote, national financial and economic resources to bring this about. That's dirigism. And because those same potentates and others fostered humanist education, including energetic programs for establishing great universities and collecting the greatest minds available and the most valuable documents available for this purpose. The ruling elites of civilization have very long memories and represent objectives and policies which have not changed essentially over thousands of years. For example, of the follies to be brushed aside, consider Karl Marx's nonsensical argument advanced in his effort to brush aside the evidence of the American Revolution. Marx argued that English capitalism was old and matured, whereas American capitalism was young, primitive, lacking the problem of high relative organic composition of industrial capital which prevailed in more matured England. Now, we should take note of that. Was Karl Marx deployed to delegitimize the principles of the American Revolution? In part, I would say yes. I think it's pretty obvious. He was a British agent after all. Factually, Marx's observation was purely conjectural and false. During the 18th century, despite the continuation of Guelphish, quote-unquote, feudal relations in the French countryside, French industrial development and French rates of industrial expansion and technological progress were in advance of those in an England which is relatively stagnating under Guelph policies of the Hanoverian monarchy. During the latter half of the 18th century, both wages and social productivities of labor in the English-speaking American colonies and the young United States were significantly higher than those in England, just as American literacy rates were more than double those in England. Take that. Wherever industrial capital was introduced in the United States, the issue which was central to the American Revolution, the quality of American technology was significantly superior to that in England. Marx's argument that the organic composition of capital had overtaken the more matured England was sheer nonsense. The, quote, high organic composition, unquote, of British capital was not the result of industrial accumulation, but of the British financial debt incurred in the effort to prevent continental Europe and England itself from developing an industrial development-centered policy. As Alexander Hamilton's 1791 report on manufactures proves clearly enough, and as Henry C. Carey stated the point bluntly and accurately, the British system was not an industrial capitalist model, but a mixed economy, quote unquote, in which the interest and dynamic of industrial capital was subordinated through the monarchy and oligarchy to parasitical landlord interest, an interest which took primitive accumulation, quote unquote, from rural landholdings as its point of reference for policy, which I guess that's a kind of monetarism. The British physiocratic doctrine, like its French imitators, expressed that point of view, exactly. The same point is exposed most nakedly by the Ford Foundation's 1964 Triple Revolution report, advocating a post-industrial society, which is, of course, WEF, right? And the coordinated launching of the international environmentalist, quote-unquote, ferment by British intelligence services networks beginning in the autumn of 1969, when they were telling us we were doomed by the inevitable ice age. What was it? Anthropogenic. What is it? They said they predicted there would be man-made ice age. I think I saw there was a documentary. Who was that? That actor, Leonard Nimoy. I think he narrated that. And then that didn't happen, so they switched over to global warming. And then that didn't happen, so they switched over to climate change, which covers up all the geoengineering, right? Once you get people fearful of something, once you get them hysterical, you can't pry them away from it either. So, despite all the it's like religion. Despite all the inconsistencies, people are still absolutely insane about this. Anyway, the targets of these British intelligence services operations have been precisely industrial development, industrialist profits, and so forth, accepting London's and its monetarist allies' perfervid preoccupation with strengthening its control of the world's nominal financial wealth, London's policy is preferably anti-capitalist. What sort of an idiot is it that would attempt to turn up a capitalist motive for the policies of British intelligence services and the British government? That's not a rhetorical question. We have the answer. The ruling black Guelph oligarchy of Britain, together with those oligarchical families, aristocratic and quasi-aristocratic, to which it is allied outside Britain, is dedicated essentially by its own statement on the matter to bringing about a new dark ages, out of which depopulated globe, reduced willfully to the order of as few as 1 billion persons through wars and economic genocide and injections by the close of the present century. I think this article was 1982, I think. I can't remember. Check it. I introduce the article and I begin, of course, in part one, all the background information. The permanent rule of the world by feudal oligarchical families is established. In short, the British monarchy and the forces rallied about it represent nothing but the effort to implement the Persian model policies of the court of Philip of Macedon in a modern technological context. That is a project Henry Kissinger, James R. Schlesinger, W. Michael Blumenthal, Zbigniew Brzezinski, and other British agents of influence within the United States represents now as emphatically as the Churchills, Mountbattens, Russells, and such British social democrats as Dennis Healey and Roy Jenkins. Why should Bertrand Russell, grandson of Lord John Russell, godson of John Stuart Mill, and deeply committed member of the Russell family branch of the Black Guelph families of Britain, ostensibly dedicate his adult life to radicalism, quote unquote? Those quotes are important. Some of you will get it. Russell had no emotional difficulty in opposing capitalism because his class, his family, have always been and remain perfervidly anti-capitalist. They are feudal oligarchs in the deepest parts of their being. They are Black Guelph in the most evil connotations of that factional commitment. They are determined to destroy capitalism and all other expressions of humanist policy in order to bring back the feudal utopia for the lasting benefit of their family's posterity. Bertrand Russell rolled for decades in the slime of Dionysian anti-capitalist cults because he was a dedicated, deeply dedicated enemy of the human species. He gave his life's work to the posterity of his evil oligarchical class. It is only as one understands the Black Guelphs in those terms of reference that one comprehends how and why they fall so frequently into wild masturbational fits in admiration of Maoist China. Granted, the late Foreign Minister Zhou Enlai had been a British agent since 1919. Yet, why their euphoria over Maoist China? It is the anti-humanist, labor-intensive, quote-unquote, bucolic obscenity of Maoist China which arouses their orgasms. It is the feudal oligarchy's zeal to restore the cult of Dionysus as the mythology of a mass of plebeians reduced to bucolic moral imbecility of human manure tossing instead of modern agricultural methods which arouses their passions. I have a sort of nuanced view of that last paragraph, but I won't bore you with it now. I'll get into it another time. We've seen the dangers of mass or industrial scale agriculture, but that's just anyway. Conversely, whenever one notes this or that ostensible quote-unquote conservative political spokesman in Western Europe or North America making an obscene public spectacle of himself in admiration of Maoist China, the persistence of such episodes is a litmus test certifying that conservative to be a British intelligence services agent, a mercenary of the Black Guelph oligarchy centered in the British monarchy. For reference, we have to remember the Venetian takeover of England to understand that very direct connection. A similar point is applicable to the case of those who rhapsodize over the memory of N. Bukharin in the Soviet Union. This connection of the British monarchy, Black Guelph oligarchy, and the British intelligence services to the Persian model is not simply an imitation resurrected through aid of Oxford and Cambridge scholars. The connection of today's Black Guelph oligarchy to the ancient Macedonian court in Ptolemaic Egypt is direct, granting the point that in places the continuing road winds somewhat. The continuity of the doctrines of Aristotle throughout the centuries into the policies and methods of the neo-Aristotelians of British empiricism, of pragmatism, is a direct continuity of anti-humanist bestiality leading into the British intelligence services of the present date. So we'll leave it there. And thanks for the listen, and see you soon.